all of these can contribute to a more lingering insulin resistance, but especially insulin, where I focus on that one the most because of not only its relevance to the slow lane, but also just how present it is, where 70% of all calories globally are carbohydrates. And now, perhaps with the best of intentions, our experts are telling us that we should be eating 6 times a day. And so we wake up in the morning, insulin has finally been coming down while we've been fasting overnight. Insulin gets to take a little bit of a break. We're fasting. Then we break that fast by eating breakfast. And in the UK, as it is in the US, by and large, this is going to be a very starchy, sugary breakfast. It's toast with some jam, or it's cereal, or it's bagels. That is almost pure glucose. And so what do? We wake up, we eat breakfast, we spike our blood sugar levels, and insulin has to come up. Insulin will take longer to come down than the blood sugar will. It will wait in the blood to make sure that all the blood sugar has gone back to normal. So depending on how much carbohydrate we ate for breakfast, it could take our insulin levels 3 or even 4 hours to come back down to normal. Long before it's had a chance to come back down to normal, we've had a mid-morning snack, of course. We need to go get a sugary coffee and another bagel or something. And so after just a couple hours, we do it again. And once again, before insulin has had a chance to come back down, we have a starchy, carbohydrate-heavy lunch, then an afternoon snack, and then a carbohydrate-heavy dinner. And then, of course, we have to have an evening snack before we go to bed. So the average individual is spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin. And thus, the signal never really goes away because they never give themselves a break. But one of the consequences of that I mentioned, which is that it directly causes insulin resistance. But when insulin is high, it starts to have a signal on the fat cell. And that then brings us to the slow insulin resistance, where you have something happening in the fat tissue that begins to set the stage for insulin resistance in the entire body. And it takes longer to settle in, but it takes also longer to go away. That's why I call this one slow insulin resistance. Now, in the case of insulin, most people, so the key with I'll explain it this way first. So the most relevant feature with fat tissue contributing to insulin resistance is the size of each fat cell. When we typically think of fat, we would maybe say, okay, Steve has, I'll do this in kilos for the UK audience. Steve has 10 kilos of fat on your entire body. That's probably too much for you. Ben has 20 kilos. And yet, it's possible that I'm healthier metabolically than you. And that's because it's not the mass of fat that matters most. It's the size of the fat cell that matters. This is why women, despite universally being fatter than her male counterparts, are healthier with regards to insulin resistance and every single metabolic problem. It's because women, as a result of her particular sex hormones, have more fat cells, but they're smaller. So she has more fat, but smaller fat cells. And small fat cells are healthy, insulin-sensitive, anti-inflammatory fat cells. But the bigger the fat cell gets, the more it initiates a cascade of events or a series of events that creates insulin resistance.
And am I right in thinking we have the same amount of fat cells for our whole life pretty much?
That's a really, really safe assumption for most people. Yeah, for most people, a fat cell, sometimes students will hear that fat cells are immortal. That is not true. But they're long-lived. Fat cells will live about 10 years. And so typically, by the time, if you look at a newborn, during infancy, childhood, and puberty, the number of fat cells is going up, 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 up. Once they finish puberty, so mid to late teens for a young woman, late teens or even early 20s for a young man, usually at that point, the number of fat cells they have is going to be very static.
We pretty much, especially as an adult, have the same amount of fat cells, really regardless of what we eat.
Yes.
And it's actually just the fat cells we have shrinking
or growing,
or expanding.
Exactly. That's exactly right. But there are differences across ethnicity. Like, this is a little oversimplified, but not much. On one end, you'd have Caucasians, kind of Northern European Caucasians. On the other end, you'd have East Asians, like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, East Asians. And then if you look at that same spectrum of people making fat cells through their life, an East Asian will be making fat cells and then stop right about here. So very few fat cells, relatively speaking, across all the ethnicities. They have very few fat cells. A Caucasian on the other end of the spectrum, they went way higher. And so this guy, let's say American Ben versus Chinese Ben, overly simplified, but here we are. So much of fat mass isn't the number of fat cells, even though American Ben has more, it's the size of the fat cell. So I could be the same percent body fat really as Chinese Ben, but that would just be because my fat cells were just that much smaller. But this is the problem then. If you have, let's say, American Ben and Chinese Ben both gained 10 kilos of pure fat over the next 10 years, very easily done. Most people do that quite often. Caucasian Ben just doesn't look as good in his Speedo, which as a pasty Caucasian, he's not going to look particularly good in that Speedo anyway. But I just am bulging a little more than I was before, but otherwise I'm healthy. My blood pressure is fine, my blood sugar is fine, everything's normal. Put that same 10 kilos of fat on Chinese Ben, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, infertility. And that is because Chinese Ben had fewer fat cells to start with. And so those fat cells, as the body was told to store fat, those fat cells were getting much, much bigger, much sooner. And the fat cell promotes insulin resistance very, very readily. And so that logically moves into the question of, well, what makes fat cells grow? And it is two essential variables that we only ever look at calories. And yet, if you take a person with type 1 diabetes and say, I want you to eat 10,000 calories, but don't give yourself your insulin injection, they cannot gain weight. It is literally impossible for the type 1 diabetic to get fat if they are skipping their insulin injections. In fact, this is so known that if you take, let's imagine a young woman who would maybe have more pressure to be thin than her male counterpart, although it's happening more in males too. Imagine a young girl who gets diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 13 or 14. Very impressionable time. She's very worried about how she looks and how thin she is. She learns that, wait a minute, I can eat whatever I want, and all I have to do is not inject my insulin, and I'll be as skinny as I want. And it works. It works so well that it's actually a formal eating disorder called diabulimia. So the fact that this exists is absolute proof that the growing and the shrinking of the fat cell is more complicated than just calories being high or low. Because like I'd said earlier, when I talked about hormones, hormones are a way for the very tissues of the body to know what it ought to do with energy. And so a fat cell will have energy all around it. And if it doesn't have insulin to tell it what to do, it won't do anything with it. Or maybe to make this more direct, back home in my lab, my students are growing fat cells in petri dishes. These fat cells are swimming in a little sea of calories, lots of glucose, lots of fats, and yet they stay really small until we add insulin. The moment we add insulin into that little petri dish, if we check those cells 4 hours later, they're immediately fatter. If we check them 4 hours later, they're fatter still. Now they know what to do with the energy they have. So with slow insulin resistance, it develops when fat cells get really, really big. It's like because they have to tell insulin, you are telling me to keep growing. I can't keep growing. I'm so big that I'm going to pop. I mean, literally, the fat cell can get so big that it degrades its membrane. It's like a water balloon that a naughty little boy has overfilled and it's about to burst. The fat cell doesn't want to burst. And so it tells insulin, you are trying to make me grow. You're telling me to grow. I can't listen anymore. I'm becoming insulin resistant to stop growing.